Right, so we talk a lot about the financing and the markets of student accommodation, but let's focus a bit on the product. What do students really want from their accommodation, and how are we seeing that evolve? And how the students pick and what they want to live in and how they value those kind of things.
I think fundamentally, from an investor perspective, if you're wanting to achieve premium rents, you've got to be providing a premium product that these people are used to. In terms of how that looks and feels, it is that premium product, and you can touch it, you can feel it on the way that you come in, and not only within the room in terms of how it's the specification of the bed, the kitchen, the shower, the look and feel of the asset as well plays hand in hand into that. And we're seeing a lot more of our clients, both owner-operators and investors, taking much more interest into actually how it feels. It's not just, here's a bed, here's a fob, 200 quid a week please. It's more of that, how the overall experience and making it an actual experience rather than just a bed for a student to live in.
I think in terms of capturing that as well, you've got to unpick the individual user's relationship with money. Like George touched on, generally speaking, the overseas students will have experienced some element of high standard of living previously. We're working with behavioural scientists on this kind of things, and we're trying to unpack it and advise our clients on how they should approach this. It's not like a usual decision. This is someone with a very different relationship with money.
Yeah, and students, one of those unique sectors, I guess, or unique businesses really, where the people paying the rents aren't necessarily the people who are living with you and experiencing it. And it comes to the whole sort of phenomenon of you paying with other people's money, right? And what does that mean? How do you behave in a building? And it's one of the kind of challenges of student accommodation, that you have two sets of customers. The ones that pay the rent but don't necessarily live with you, but expect a certain level of service. Whether that is making sure that the buildings are safe, they're secure, and that everything they're getting transparency. And then the student who actually lives with you, who's expecting a building which is fun but safe and secure at the same time, but is a community and but has a level of service that it sort of promises. I always sort of tell the story, I think, about how 20 years ago, the first generation of student accommodation, the managers were always ex-army. So the majors and the generals, because students are horrible people and, they're going to ruin the place, to now, we're recruiting managers and staff within buildings from 5-star hotels, in the Middle East or wherever, and just how that's changed in such a short space of time in terms of, service delivery, I think is important, because the customers are incredibly discerning, is what we're kind of, I suppose, the feedback we're seeing.
From a service perspective, the lines are blurring, aren't they? BTR, PBSA, levels of hospitality coming into that. It's certainly blurring, and to have a narrow mind in terms of how you treat your clients, tenants essentially, is pretty simple way of looking at things.
I think one of our clients actually did a survey into what was their best amenity offering post-pandemic, to get a better understanding of the efficiencies of their products and the service that their clients are actually wanting. And actually what came out on top was, links back into your point just then around managers, the asset managers or the managers of the property were the key number one amenity. It's not a physical amenity that you can go use, it's a person, it's an individual. It links back to that holistic experience we've all been speaking about around having that luxury experience and having that feel of almost a parent away from home for lots of the international students. And it's having that pastoral care element to it, which is having a huge influence on students wanting to either rebook or stay in the accommodation.
Yeah, the value of the intangibles and the tangibles, I think, is really important. I think, again, as real estate people, we tend to just focus on what you can touch and feel. Has it got a common room? Has it got a gym? Has it got a cinema room? But actually the intangibles, do I feel safe? Do I feel secure? Is there a good community here? Is there a diversity of offer? Can I approach the staff? Are they looking after my stuff? It's all of those kind of things that, actually is the reason why you go back to, 5-star hotels. And it's the same kind of value drivers. And it's how the question is, that I don't think any of us necessarily have the scientific answer for, is what's the value of all of that? But I think what is clear is that there is a lot of value that is put on the intangibles as much as the tangibles in these buildings.
Well, we're getting closer. I mean, it's people saying we can't put a value on it, but we are getting closer to the point where we can put values on these things, and it might be a range, but we're getting there.
How important is operator when it comes to looking at the developments and viability? understanding who's going to actually operate the buildings and what rents are they going to charge, and I suppose maintaining and managing operational expenditure as well.
The operator for me is one of the most important aspects of a development, and who that is and getting that strategic partner correct. You go on a journey from, it's not just agreeing a DFA, exchanging, and then they come in with 3 months to go. They need to be involved from the outset, and by that I mean in terms of how the property actually works from both a design perspective and working with the architects and working with the planners around getting the right accommodation in the right spot. So I think the operator now, there's more of a premium on getting the correct operator in than there has been ever before. Then if you then link that into operational expenditure, the bigger the operator, the more efficiencies they could potentially get from a utilities perspective. Obviously that's incredibly prevalent at the moment, and allowing that economies of scale to take place is fundamentally going to have a knock-on impact onto your bottom line and on the NOI, and that is from an investment perspective what you're looking to drive. There are different levers you can pull to drive that, and having the right operator is one of the most significant ones, definitely, around getting the product right to then get the rents and then ultimately have an impact on your bottom line.
Yeah, and it's also understanding how markets behave, whether they let up early, whether they let up later, the different kind of routes to market and funnels, and also maintaining the university relationships as well. I think, that's certainly one thing I think is probably we don't put enough emphasis on is making sure that the university, who is probably the third customer after the parent and the student, making sure that they're happy as well, because the accommodation reflects them, I guess, in a certain way as well, and the quality of the offer that they're offering.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think we always talk about, we always get asked, is around markets being saturated, whether we're looking at student accommodation or residential or things like that. Are we in danger of any markets becoming really, truly saturated, and how do we answer that question and look at the analysis?
I think I'll answer that question starting from a top-down approach. On top, the demand for student accommodation is growing, and at the moment the supply is not matching that. If you then look at mini markets around that, what you have markets that go through phases, and markets go through a phase where the demand creeps up and then the supply matches it, and then all of a sudden the supply story starts to warn off investors from potentially building that pipeline. So what happens is the demand catches up, and then all of a sudden it tips the other way. And there's countless examples within the UK of that happening, and actually the cyclical nature of PBSA in specific markets is something that we're seeing almost on a yearly basis around markets changing that quickly. Speak to some investors 12 months ago, they wouldn't touch X market, and you speak to them now, all of a sudden it's flavour of the month. And I think that leads back into the whole thing that we've spoken about throughout this conversation, is the top-down approach around what's driving the demand, and then how supply are going to match that moving forward.
Yeah, there's so many moving parts, aren't there, I think, to this. It's very easy to just sort of say, well, let's look at supply and let's look at demand and come up with some sort of ratio. I think one of the things we've certainly seen in the markets over the years is the segmentation of supply as well, into kind of basic, premium levels, different types of offering. And I think it's probably understanding the demand and supply dynamics within those different verticals as well, which leads you to kind of understand whether it's a market you want to be in at the time. I think one of the things we've also probably seen quite a lot of is understanding digestion in markets, and invariably PBSA gets digested. It just depends how much is being built at that time. So I suppose it's a timing thing, really, isn't it, as to when you enter that market, and what making sure that there's not necessarily 10,000 beds being delivered. Because ultimately they will be digested, and then the next couple of years there might be 2 or 3, and actually that's a kind of a tolerable level for that particular market. So guys, what other markets offer opportunity across Europe from a student perspective?
I think we've focused a lot on overseas students looking at the UK, but the reality is they're a transient group, whether this be sort of Iberian Peninsula. We see a lot of activity there, but you have to realise that this isn't a UK thing. They pretty much go anywhere.
Yeah, and I suppose Europe is probably where the UK was 5, 10, 15 years ago, in terms of its levels of supply and it being controlled by the universities and things like that. So it's very, there's probably a lot more of an early mover advantage, in that space as well. Do you think across Europe, we want to see the same types of product, or do you see there being more of an evolution of the kind of operational model, across the space?
I think, having spoken to our EMEA colleagues, it varies from market to market, and I think that can be said even within the UK for geographically. I think in terms of the type of product and where you can get the most value from an investment perspective, it's going to be understanding that micro market and exactly what the students in those specific locations want. And I think that leads back to having people on the ground that actually have a true understanding of the market drivers and the dynamics of that. And I think that's where someone like ourselves, from a service line perspective, having our offices in Spain, Denmark, Germany and Italy, we can offer those sorts of conversations and actually have the on-the-ground understanding of those local markets. And that's where we can feed into that supply-demand picture for our investors.
It's the cultural piece, isn't it, I think, and the behavioural piece. And it's the same whether it's any market, any product. It's understanding who do you think your customers are going to be and how do they behave. And I think what we've certainly seen from talking to our colleagues and looking at the different operations across Europe is that people do behave differently, whether it's domestic groups or international groups. Some are more wedded to studying closer to home and don't necessarily need accommodation or need a different type of accommodation. Some travel much further, and I think it's those little nuances that if you're just looking at the hard numbers, you could kind of go in and say, oh wow, this is totally undersupplied. But in some markets, actually, there is undersupply because people don't move very far. But there's definitely a trend, isn't there, Lee? I think across Europe of even people moving within their own cities and for work, for study, and that mobility across the kind of student age group is becoming much higher.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think an important thing to consider is we shouldn't be afraid of trying to unpack it. We just because it doesn't live neatly in a spreadsheet somewhere, we shouldn't be shy about trying to get underneath the skin of it and really understand what those behaviours are. And I think that's what we're doing, and that's what we're trying to do in the BTR space, in the PBSA space, is not be scared off by things that don't necessarily live on spreadsheets. Let's really get a look at these things.
Yeah, it links back to the intangibles and everything we've spoken about so far. That is the stuff you can't touch, you can't see in a spreadsheet, and you can't feel unless you're there and in those local markets and actually understanding and getting that feel. And that comes with time spent in these locations and speaking to the right experts that can guide you there.